Time now for our first intermission feature, Opera News on the Air. Father Owen Lee is professor of Greek and Latin classical literature at St. Michael's College, the University of Toronto. He will discuss Wagner and Lohengrin, illustrating his remarks with musical examples at the Baldwin. Father Lee.
Thank you, Peter Allen. If you've ever been to Switzerland, and what American given a chance to go to Europe doesn't visit Switzerland, you'll have seen widely advertised as one of the excursions the trip to the Rigi. Wagner took his first wife Minna on that trip in the year 1850. Lohengrin was being given its first performance anywhere, far, far away in Weimar, and they couldn't be there. And she cried, partly because she knew he'd been unfaithful. And they both needed something by way of a reconciliation. So up the Rigi they went, and from the top of the mountain, it was as if they could see all the world. Wagner was in exile in Switzerland. Minna had always pleaded with him not to get politically involved. But how could he not? This hot-headed young German. He was excited about the possibility of his divided Germany coming together. He'd been actively involved in the revolutionary uprising in Dresden, supplying ammunition, haranguing the insurgents at the barricades, dodging bullets in the steeple of the Kreuzkirche. He was sure back then that a new united Germany was being born. An important part of his new Lohengrin told how a German king once traveled the length and breadth of German-speaking lands to unite them. But the Dresden Revolution failed, and Lohengrin remained unperformed, and Wagner had to flee Germany with forged papers and an assumed name and a price on his head. He found refuge in Zurich, and there he wrote no music for almost 6 years, as he rethought all his ideas about politics, music, drama, and much besides. When he broke his silence with the first notes of The Ring, he was a wholly different composer and a very great one. Some Wagnerites will not bother themselves with anything Wagner wrote before that first E-flat chord of The Ring. But Wagner himself longed, while the Ring music was shaping in him, Wagner longed to hear Lohengrin. Lohengrin, with its hope for German unity, and its hero who was so much an idealization of his young self. He sent the score to Franz Liszt in Weimar, and pleaded with him to get it on the stage. Liszt, always willing to help other men of genius, complied. And on the day of the premiere, Wagner, far away in Switzerland, took Minna up the Rigi. And there in the mountains, he was, like an Old Testament prophet, confirmed in his mission by a sign. In the Rigi, there sometimes occurs a natural phenomenon called the Rigi specter. It occurred that day as the sun set. Wagner, who loved mountains and loved taking risks, walked to the edge of the abyss and saw a giant reflection of himself cast across the misty sky over the towering peaks. His head was haloed in light, and so he knew, this little man with titanic dreams, he knew that way beyond the Alps, Lohengrin, his romantic opera on German unity, would be a success, and that his plans for a new work, eventually to be 4 operas on the nature of the world itself, would also come to realization. 12 more years passed before Wagner heard his Lohengrin, and as the time of exile wore on, and Lohengrin was performed in his absence all over Germany, Wagner said, pleased with his success, but laughing in his pain, that he just might be the only German who had never heard it. When an orchestra was assembled in Zurich to give a concert of his music, and Wagner, conducting the rehearsals, actually heard for the first time his own Lohengrin prelude with the absolutely new sound of the A major 8-part string writing, he wrote to Liszt, "I had to get a good grip on myself not to break down." What he finally heard, and what forever after the greatest orchestrators were to marvel at, was an astonishing use of orchestral textures to suggest color. A major is almost invariably thought a bright key. Mozart loved it. A major suggested the gleam of gold, or perhaps shining silver. Yet Wagner, dividing his first and second violins each into 4 parts, and setting them to play in the upper reaches of their registers, Wagner makes this traditionally bright key suggest the soft expanses of a blue sky. A vision of the Holy Grail begins to form in that blue, and the music passes almost imperceptibly from A to E, and then, as the sacred cup appears in its full glory, to D major. All 3 keys associated again with brightness. D major is certainly right for the full revelation of the burnished, blazing Grail. At that moment we get brass and a full orchestra. But the wonder of the prelude is how, before that, Wagner's divided strings changed the effect of these predominantly sharp keys, turning them ethereally soft. Blue is the Lohengrin color. Thomas Mann spoke lovingly of its blau-silberne Schönheit, its silvery blue beauty. Baudelaire said that the ethereal prelude held him suspended in a preternatural state, in an ecstasy compounded of joy and insight. Insight. Baudelaire, with a poet's perception, rightly sensed that Lohengrin was not just a romantic tale of knighthood in flower, not just a patriotic call for the unification of Germany, but something for all times and places. He sensed that Lohengrin was about the soul. In recent years, we've come to see the Ring that way as taking place within the human psyche, with the rivers and forests, the landscape of the unconscious, the storms and calms, our inner emotions, with Wotan as consciousness, and Brünnhilde as will, and Loge as instinct, and Erda as intuition. Wagner himself said as much. In an attempt to explain what he was doing, he said, long before Freud or Jung, that it was the purpose of art, quote, to make the unconscious conscious. Well, the beginnings of that kind of drama are in Lohengrin. Set in an historically detailed Antwerp, it nonetheless suggests something more than that time and that place, and its characters are something more than personages in history or legend. They are figures of myth. If you've ever seen Lohengrin, you can't have helped remarking that, though Ortrud is on stage all through Act 1, she says nothing. She only expresses her inner thoughts in the ensembles. Telramund does all the talking for her. She is in a strange sort of reciprocal relationship with him. He speaks, she is silent, but she is the strong one. He is her public spokesman, no more. He is slain the very moment her end is achieved. He is dispensable. She seduced him for her ends, and willed him to be what he became. They are an interesting pair, destructive forces operating interdependently, he the outer, she the inner one. Well, I can see an even more interesting reciprocal relationship between Lohengrin and Elsa, something truly mythic. When Wagner tried to explain Lohengrin and Elsa to his friends, he used the myth of Zeus and Semele. The Greek sky god Zeus once left his Olympian light to love the mortal woman Semele, and in the darkness she asked him to reveal himself openly in all his glory. He had told her never to ask that, but ask she did, and to show his love for her he came to Semele in all his thunder and light, and the full sight of him killed her. Like most myths, this is about the human psyche. Man and woman, Wagner said, are like two parts of the soul. He is consciousness, brightness, light. She is the unconscious, the dark intuitive. Each needs the other. The young, politically oriented Wagner identified with the man when he wrote Lohengrin. Later, writing the mythic Ring, he looked back on Lohengrin and saw that the woman was part of him too, an essential part of him, his questioning intuition, the true source of his creativity. Elsa, he exclaimed, Elsa, the unconscious, the intuitive, in whom Lohengrin's consciousness longs to be fulfilled. Elsa, the true feminine, who can save me and the world. Elsa, the feminine, hitherto not understood by me, now understood at last. Ernest Newman at this point said, "Well, who in the name of heaven takes Lohengrin and Elsa so seriously as that?" Andrew Porter responds rightly, "Wagner did." Wagner was already moving on to Brünnhilde, the questioning, intuitive, saving woman of the Ring, and he was strikingly anticipating modern psychology, wherein the human person seeks wholeness, integration, union between consciousness, the male principle, and the unconscious, the female principle. With Lohengrin and the Ring, Wagner began to realize what he was doing in his art. He was, quote, making the unconscious conscious. He was mapping out that lost continent that lies deep in the soul, the world we usually experience in dreams or know from myths. Perhaps all this began for Wagner musically when he wrote the first mysterious pages of Lohengrin's Act II. That last theme is the forbidden question. Nie sollst du mich befragen, that you must never ask me. What about the forbidden question Elsa asks? That's a familiar motif in myth, doing the forbidden thing. It's in the myth of Semele, as Wagner reminds us. It's also in the myth of Psyche, the beautiful princess whose very name means soul. In the darkness, Psyche lit a lamp and looked on her lover, though he had told her not to, and she lost him. She opened a jar she was told not to look into, and fell into a deathly sleep. And then there is the first woman in Greek myth, Pandora. Her name means all goods. She was given a box and told not to open it, but she did, and found it was filled with all evils. It was she who brought evil into the world. And what, along with the breaking of the imposed taboo, have all of these stories of disobedient women in common? Instant sorrow, but ultimate good. For when Semele is destroyed, her unborn child is rescued. He is Dionysus, god of the dark unconscious. And when Psyche is near to death, her lover rescues her. He is Eros, god of sexual passion. And when Pandora unleashes all the evils on the world, she finds one last winged creature inside the box after all the others have flown away. It is Elchis, the spirit of hope. Instant sorrow, ultimate good. In Judeo-Christian tradition, there is the greatest of these taboo-breaking women, Eve. She eats of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which she was told not to do. And so she ends for herself and for her Adam a life of preternatural bliss. She brings instant sorrow to herself and to all her descendants. But the Church in her liturgy says that ultimately the disobedience was a felix culpa, a happy fault, because it began the whole wonderful plan of redemption and brought us eventually a Redeemer in Jesus. I think mythologists agree, and I think all but the most fundamentalist Christian writers agree, that these taboo-breaking stories describe a great evolutionary moment in human prehistory, when the human race passed from a blissful state of unconsciousness, a state when man lived only through instinct, to the much more problematic state of consciousness, when reason emerged and men started to think and to know what was good and what was evil. At first it must have seemed a catastrophe, a tragic loss. Ultimately, it was a triumph. You will become like gods. That was the message the tempter gave to Eve. And he was right. Man evolved, emerged into a state where, like God, he could know. Now, here's something we might well ponder. Aren't the taboos in myth meant to be broken? When God put the tree in the garden and told his man and woman not to eat, didn't he know they would? Didn't he plan it so that they would evolve? And so too with Pandora and Psyche and Semele. And if it is the woman in all these myths who takes the evolutionary step first, it's not because she is the more frail. It's because she is the more intuitive. She knows intuitively that the step must be taken. Then, despite immediate loss, there will be ultimately progress. Elsa has often been thought a wan and witless heroine. I hope now she's beginning to look more important in the scheme of things in Lohengrin. And now we should look at last to Lohengrin's most eloquent symbol, the swan. The myth-makers of the Dark and Middle Ages, the best intuitors in our Western tradition, introduced the swan into their version of the woman breaking the taboo myth. The swan is clearly meant to be significant. What then does the swan mean? Wagner gives his swan a two-note motif, just the wave of a graceful wing, or the wail of a sad song. It falls. That swan motif actually comes out of the opening music of the prelude, when, in the soft blue, a vision of the Grail begins to form. The swan motif is there, falling. Wagner uses the swan motif again in his other opera about the Holy Grail, Parsifal, where it sounds like this. So Wagner associates the swan with the Grail. And what do our specialists in medieval symbols say about the swan? Jacques de Morgan in L'Humanité Préhistorique notes that in many mythologies, spirited horses pull the sun across the sky by day. But it is the swan that draws the sun under the world by night. Gaston Bachelard sees the swan as signifying the integration of male and female principles. And Juan Cirlot, in his Dictionary of Symboles Traditionales, says that in medieval alchemy, the swan was the harbinger of change, of transformation. All of these associations, an unconscious underlying consciousness, an integration of psychic opposites, a transformation, all of these fit with our observations so far. And Carl Jung, the most important interpreter of symbols for our time, and so often the most helpful in interpreting Wagner, sees the swan as a transcendent symbol, a symbol that bears witness to the existence of a world beyond the world we know. What does the swan in Lohengrin mean? On a historical level, it is a sign from outside history that the German nations may now move towards a transformation, towards unity and integration. But on a deeper mythic level, the swan is a symbol that the human soul, the real stage on which Lohengrin is played, can be transformed. There is a power outside the soul that can touch it and transform it, though some happy fault may be needed to bring about the evolutionary progress. I won't say that this is all that the swan means, for myths are always wiser than any interpretations drawn from them, but it is clear that transformations are at work quickly with the transformation of the swan at the close of Lohengrin. Lohengrin leaves, Elsa dies, Elsa's asking the forbidden question brings instant sorrow, but ultimate good. Ortrud's evil power deserts her, and Gottfried appears, like Dionysus, or Eros, or Elpis, or Jesus, the hope for the future. The chorus sings as the last words, sorrow, sorrow. But the orchestra, with the omniscience Wagner's orchestra was to have forever after, the orchestra plays the Grail motif without the swan in it, for a transcendent power has worked the needed transformation. The theme does not fall. It lifts to a last shining silver blue chord. All this appealed powerfully to a romantic young king who longed for such a transformation in himself and loved Lohengrin and built swan castles, even a lake with a swan boat in it to externalize his longings. Perhaps that king, Ludwig, should have the last say on Lohengrin. All the same, I'll save the last say for myself. I love Lohengrin. When I see or hear it, I'm with Wagner on some precipice, and I see myself projected against the sky. Like Baudelaire, I'm suspended in a preternatural state blended of ecstasy and insight. I can sense that there is a world that transcends this one, and in one brief shining moment, it can touch me. I sense, too, that I am made to be more than I am. There are transformations that can still be worked in me, in my consciousness and my intuition, in my masculine and my feminine. Even if I fail, all is not lost. Truly human failings can be happy faults, and at the end of all is an A major, silvery blue beauty. Maybe that's a fairy tale vision, a false vision of reality. I think it's more than that. Wagner saw long before Freud what we have learned since, that myths are about what happens or can happen within all of us. Within all of us, Lohengrin happens on the landscape of the soul.
Thank you, Father Lee.